Can you guys hear me? All right, I'm gonna move this slightly. All right, can you hear me better now? Good, okay. So my name is Gabriel Ryan. I'm a security engineer, penetration tester at Gotham Digital Science in our New York office. We're like kind of like a boutique consulting firm, do some research as well. So a couple new things in this presentation. We're gonna talk about hostile portal attacks, which is a means of stealing Active Directory credentials from WPA-EAP networks without direct network access. We're also going to talk about something else, indirect wireless pivots. It's a way of using rogue AP attacks to bypass port-based access controls on wireless networks. I apologize for the speed at which I'm going to be flying through this, because limited time slot, so there's a lot of information to cover. With that said, I'm going to try to make the slides available tonight, and also I'm going to try to, I'm going to do my best attempt at translating them into French. We're going to see how well it's going to. I'm sure I'll have plenty of people to critique that, but I will do my best. Okay, so before we go, kind of go into like the meat of this talk, we should talk about WPA-EAP. And before we talk about WPA-EAP, we kind of have to talk about rogue AP attacks, which are the means which traditionally you'd use to attack these kinds of networks. So the rogue AP attack, I mean, it's pretty much the bread and butter of the modern wireless penetration test. And that's because you can use them for like a lot of really cool things. You can use them for man-in-the-middle attacks, stealing radius credentials, all kinds of really neat stuff. There are many variations of this kind of attack, but at its core, the most simple one is something called an evil twin attack. And the way that this works, if you look at this kind of diagram we have on the screen here, we have these 4 wireless devices, these 4 laptops, and they're associated with an open network that's running on channel 6, and we're going to pick on DEF CON a little bit, and they're running DEF CON open as their network name, or their ESSID. And the question here is, if we were to create a nearby access point with that same network name on that same channel, how would these devices be able to distinguish between the 2 access points? Any ideas? Well, so it's kind of weird. It boils down to signal strength and signal to noise ratio, which from a security mechanism is not great, because an attacker can just create their own access point with the same network name on the same channel, and like a lot of RF protocols, wireless essentially, whoever has the stronger signal strength, these devices will actually drop their connection and connect to the stronger access point. So an attacker could take advantage of that to create a really simple man-in-the-middle attack that's also very difficult to spot. These attacks they're not anything new, actually. They've been around for quite some time. I mean, the first documentation that I could find of them, and it's not to say that this was the first time they were used, but like it was actually, so here you see in 2004, there's like this thing I'm going to mention in a second by Dezovi and Shane McCauley. They actually cite someone back in 2002 who's talking about this, and this is the WLAN security pack by C.W. Klaus. 2003, you see ESLEAP starts to kind of like, this is actually implemented against EAP MD5 and stuff like that. 2004, we actually start to see something else called a karma attack, which we're not going to talk about in depth today, but it's a kind of a more sophisticated kind of rogue AP attack that's absolutely classic at this point. 2008, this is where we actually see rogue AP attacks first used as a means of attacking enterprise networks or EAP networks, which is, we're going to be building off of that. In 2014, by this point, the karma attack that we mentioned earlier, improvements in client, client device security essentially made them a lot less effective than they used to be. So 2 researchers from South Africa, Dom White and Ian de Villiers, actually just kind of really improved upon the existing karma attack mechanisms and made it very relevant again. And then in 2017, we have Lure 10. So very recently, actually, the guy who wrote Wi-Fi Fisher found a way to exploit Windows 10's Wi-Fi Sense capabilities for like an entirely new type of rogue AP attack. So as you can see, we have quite a rich history of using rogue AP attacks in the wireless security community, but they typically fall into 2 categories, man-in-the-middle attacks for stealing credentials or something that you'd use to breach a wireless network. We're going to do something a little different in this talk, and that's using rogue AP attacks as a means of lateral movement. So now we've gone over rogue AP attacks, we also need to talk about WPA-EAP. Anyone here familiar with how EAP works? All right, cool. Actually, so essentially, like, there are 2 ways to explain this. I'm going to go with the simplified version first, and then build into like the fuller picture. We're going to be concentrating on 2 variations. So EAP stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol, and the reason why it's extensible is there are many ways to implement it. Essentially, you're going to have an outer authentication that happens first, and that the idea of this outer authentication is you establish trust in the transaction. And then once you do that, you implement some kind of inner authentication mechanism that actually is where you authenticate to the authentication server. But how you go about implementing this two-stage process is pretty much up to you. So there are many different variations of it. The two most common ones are EAP-PEAP or EAP-PEAP or EAP-TTLS. And they both kind of, we can kind of lump them together for the purposes of this talk. Logically, they work like this. You have a client device. If you want to be technical about it, this is your wireless client or supplicant. It's going to send an authentication request to an authentication server. This is like your radio server running in the background. This is essentially saying to the server, I want to authenticate. So the server at this point is going to respond with an X509 certificate. Now the job of this X509 certificate is to establish to the client that the authentication server is who it says it is. So it's establishing a trust relationship. At this point, the client can choose to accept or reject the certificate. If the client accepts the certificate, it means that it now trusts the authentication server, and it can proceed from the outer authentication, which we just kind of went over, to the inner authentication, which is going to happen through a secure tunnel, SSL-TLS tunnel. And the reason why this happens through a secure tunnel, by the way, is that what happens in this inner authentication, this is where credentials are entered. This is where your username and password is used to construct an MS-CHAP-V2 challenge response, which is sent to the authentication server, and if all goes well, hopefully it'll be authenticated with the network. Without the secure tunnel, well, so interesting thing about WPA-EAP. On a wireless network, your means of authenticating with the network is your ability to successfully encrypt or decrypt traffic. If you're not able to do that, then you're not authenticated with the network. So what this means, though, is that because EAP is the means of providing access to these WPA capabilities, until this authentication process succeeds and completes, this entire process is happening over open Wi-Fi. And as we talked about earlier, well, I mean, at first, I mean, before we started using the secure tunnel, so legacy implementations of EAP like EAP MD5, you could actually sniff this process passively and get access to the network pretty easily that way. So the secure tunnel kind of prevents that from happening. So, I mentioned there were actually two components to this: the client, wireless client or supplicant, and the authentication server. Actually, there's a third party involved, and this is your wireless access point, also known as the authenticator, right? And the reason why we need this third party is that the supplicant or wireless client device, your laptop or whatever, is only going to be speaking on layer 2. And the authentication server speaks radius, which is a layer 7 protocol. So you need this intermediary device, your access point, to relay communication between these two entities. So your complete graph here actually looks like this. And it looks very similar to what we just went over. But as you see, we've actually put the access point or authenticator in the middle of this transaction. So we mentioned that this is essentially happening over open Wi-Fi, and the way that we're establishing trust between the client and the authentication server is this one-way certificate. Does anyone see where this could be exploited yet? Any ideas? All right, so we went over evil twin attacks. Remember how open networks are susceptible to evil twin attacks? And remember how this whole process essentially is what is being used to provide access to the WPA capabilities of the network. So essentially, this is open Wi-Fi. Well, essentially what that means is that this whole process is susceptible to rogue AP attacks. What you can do as an attacker is create your own WPA2 EAP network, force a client to connect to you using the rogue AP attack that we talked about in the beginning, and then they'll try to, essentially at that point, you'll present them with an X509 certificate that you've created yourself. So at this point, it's going to show up to them as an untrusted certificate, but if they accept it, and that's a big if, but if they accept it, and trust me, in an organization of at least 200 people, you'll find some person who accepts the certificate every time. So if they accept the certificate, then they proceed to the inner authentication process with you, the attacker, and you can then capture an MS-CHAP-V2 challenge and response, which you can crack to get radius credentials and access to the network. So this is not a new attack. I mean, as I mentioned, this actually first came out in 2008. And so it essentially, when you do perform this attack, what you'll get is an MS-CHAP-V2 challenge and response. They're going to look like hashes, basically. And the initial, the first attack that came out to, the first version of this attack, so to speak, once you had these, essentially you'd have to perform a dictionary attack. So you just successfully try different passwords or try brute forcing or something until you're able to crack these hashes, which is not very efficient. I mean, it would seem that if you're going to use that approach, you could solve this problem just by using a really long password. Well, cool thing is back in 2012, so 4 years after this attack came out, two really cool researchers by the name of Moxie Marlinspike and David Holton came up with a divide and conquer attack, which actually, what they figured out is that MS-Chat-v2, you can actually boil it down to 3DES. And the problem with 3DES, as you may or may not be aware of, is that you can reduce it to 56 bits of DES encryption, which, with the proper, FPGA-based cracking rig or like sufficiently powerful cracking rig, you can actually, crack these hashes 100% of the time within 24 hours. So essentially, with the presence of this divide and conquer attack that you can use against MS-Chat-v2, this entire attack becomes a situation in which you can capture these hashes very easily, then crack them very, very quickly as well. And here's a quick demonstration. I don't know what the regulatory stuff is over here, so I have a video. But essentially, the attacker is going to create a forged certificate. And then an access point is going to be created. That's going to be a clone of the target access point. In this case, we have SSID Evil Corp. Any Mr. Robot fans here? So it's going to sit a second. And yeah, so here you see the client device is connecting to the authentication process is beginning. And pretty soon you should see MS-Chat-v2 challenge and response show up on the screen. There we go. So then you take those and then you crack them. So the mitigation for this was also introduced in 2008 very quickly. It's called EAP TLS. And it uses mutual authentication, using mutual certificate-based authentication actually, for the outer layer of EAP authentication. And by doing this, it actually manages to stop the initial evil twin attack completely in its tracks. So completely, resolves this issue. Unfortunately, it had a really, really poor adoption rate, and that's because it's, anyone like network administrators, we're covering network administrators in the, yeah. So basically, if you think about the challenge here, this is a really, this is a really secure technology, but it requires you to install a certificate on every single client device on your network. Naturally, if you have like a massive organization that this is going to cost a lot of money and require a lot of hours and stuff like that. So there's a lot of resistance to doing this. Because, really it introduces a classic security versus convenience scenario. As a network administrator, you're kind of forced to choose between EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS, which have really bad known weaknesses, or a very secure but also like seemingly impractical authentication mechanism in the form of EAP-TLS. So, this has created a huge market gap for products that can be used to kind of like, balance these two issues. They can compensate for the security issues found in EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS, but are also easy to use. And the current trend in kind of this area is to focus on breach containment rather than prevention. And I guess what we're going to be doing today is kind of seeing whether or not that actually works. So before we continue, I have a little cartoon for you. It's kind of a foreshadowing of things to come. Okay. So the most common way by far to approach this problem of breach containment is to use a NAC. A NAC, if you're not aware, is a network access control device. The way the network access control device, well, the way that this thing works, the idea is it's supposed to be able to distinguish between authorized and unauthorized endpoints on the network. So essentially, you add a new device to the wireless network. This NAC device is going to identify whether you're authorized to be there or not. If you're not authorized to be there, it's going to place it in quarantine, like a quarantine VLAN or something like that, or possibly just block the port entirely. And by doing that, you're able to compensate for the perimeter weaknesses, because even if they get on the network, they're not going to be able to get very far. There are two ways of doing this traditionally. There's some next generation ideas that we're going to talk about as well. But traditionally, you've had two kinds of NAC appliance. You've had an agent-based NAC and an agentless NAC. And the agent-based NAC, it's pretty cool. You have actually have a software component that's installed in every single endpoint on your network. And the idea is the software component is going to communicate with like a centralized control system and report back information about the internals of all these devices. So naturally, if you don't have this piece of software and you're on the network, you're going to get flagged and not going to get very far. So it's pretty secure. It's also nearly as impractical as EAP-TLS, because once again, you have something that you have to put on every single endpoint on your network. And you run all the same compatibility issues as well. On the other side of the spectrum, there is the agentless NAC. And this uses purely external methods, so passive fingerprinting, active scanning, but purely external methods to identify authorized and unauthorized endpoints. But because it's purely external, it's not able to examine the internals of network components. And you can actually bypass these pretty easily just by masquerading as an authorized device. So this actually brings us back to like the same recurring dilemma that we kind of looked at before, which is insecurity versus impracticality. We have another market gap that's created for a solution that can do the same deep interrogation capabilities of an agent-based NAC, but without all that additional overhead. And this has given rise to something, the rise of what's known as the next generation NAC, which is products that essentially position themselves to be the best of both worlds. I guess so I actually I had one of these that I wanted to bring here. So I kind of, because I know we had one at work, I had some spares lying around. I put in a ticket, this is kind of a silly idea, I put in a ticket to our IT department to see if I could borrow one. Naturally, they just, yeah, so that didn't go as planned. Also, I got a nice little email from legal saying dude, you can't call them out by name like this. So we're gonna refer to this as vendor A, but I mean, the point remains the same. So essentially I think a really good example of next generation solutions which try to bridge this gap is vendor A. And vendor A, it uses WMI to interrogate new devices, which is a pretty cool idea. And by using WMI, it's supposed to be able to perform these internal checks on these endpoints without using an agent. So essentially the way that it does this involves, this device, whenever a new endpoint's added to the network, it's going to authenticate with this endpoint over SMB using a single service account, administrative service account. And the service account, it has to be given remote login privileges to all authorized devices on the network at the group policy level. And this allows the device to perform deep interrogations without using an agent. This also creates a single point of failure because you have this device that essentially has really powerful levels of access, often given DA creds for some reason that I cannot fathom. But and anytime you add a new device to endpoint to the network, it's going to try to authenticate with it. And if you look at issues the first issue that comes to mind is the possibility of performing an SMB relay attack or an NTLM relay attack, where this thing is attempting to authenticate with you over NTLM, so you can just relay this authentication attempt to something else on the network and just start pivoting into literally everything. So a lot of whys in this situation, of course, you could just enable SMB signing, which is where you will digitally sign NTLM packets, and this kind of prevents you from doing the whole SMB relay thing. But I mean, you still have a situation in which you're being sent these really powerful hashes as soon as you get on the network, and that's your primary method of stopping attackers. So, interesting thing is actually, if kind of pressed about it, this vendor will actually, they do have a piece of software that you can also install on every single device on the network, and it remediates this issue, but once again, this is starting to sound a bit like an agent. And considering the chief selling point here is that no agent's supposed to be required, I feel like we're kind of back to square one here. The reason why I like this example, I mean, it's not really to call out, I think it's just a great example of the fact that there's no silver bullet. Security with convenience, it's very much a paradox, and you should be particularly careful when you're trying to implement a solution that's supposed to kind of give you both. So, yeah, that's a little bit about NACs. We should also talk about client isolation. So wireless client isolation, essentially it's a security control, or it's used as security control, should I say. And the idea here is that you should, as an AP, I mean, the way 802.11 is supposed to work is that this access point, right, is mediating all communication on this network. So in theory, what this means is if you want to stop client devices, so if you have a bunch of laptops on a network and you don't want them to be able to communicate with each other, just reach the internet, you should be able to do that because this access point should be capable of receiving that packet and just simply dropping it. The problem is that when we talk about client isolation, I mean, on a wireless network, it really is a logical control, not a physical control. The problem is how do you prevent radio transceivers from communicating with one another? Actually, a really awesome researcher, unfortunately is no longer with us, Cedric Blanchard, back in 2005, his answer was quite simply, you can't. And he came up with this really cool tool called Wi-Fi tap that can be used to bypass client isolation. It was later revived by Oliver Lavery at GDS, way before my time, but that happened. And the way Wi-Fi tap works is that it reads packets from the victim to the AP using a monitor mode interface and injects responses to those packets as if they came from the access point. And this is really cool because it lets you get around the client isolation issue because this guy, if he receives packets that presumably are coming directly from this laptop here, this laptop is going to be like, well, wait a minute, this packet is not coming from the access point, therefore I'm not going to honor it. But if you just inject a packet as if it's coming from the access point, you can kind of get around it that way. And it's actually, what's really neat about this tool is it gives you like a ton tap device that's bridged to the monitor mode interface, and you can use that to interact directly with open wireless networks without even being associated with the wireless network at all. So, I mean, there's some later tools that do some pretty cool stuff that kind of builds off of this. I mean, with AirCrack Suite, it has AirTonNG and TKIP-TonNG. AirTonNG actually lets you do this with web networks. TKIP-TonNG lets you do this with WPA-1 networks. Theoretically, I mean, there was this theory that came out known as Hole 196 several years ago that, you know, I guess the idea was that you should theoretically be able to do this with WPA2 networks. This has been the subject of fierce debate whether this actually works. I personally am highly skeptical as to whether it does, because I feel like there'd actually be a proof of concept by now, if it was viable. But I'm just kind of including it here for the sake of being thorough. But here's like a quick demo of Wi-Fi tap doing its thing. You know, so we have 3 terminals here. This one belongs to a virtual machine, and it's going to be used to create an open network, open Wi-Fi access point. This one on the left is another virtual machine. That's going to be our attacker. And this one here on the right, the bottom right, is going to be it actually corresponds to our host operating system, which we're going to be using as our victim, and is going to be connected to this access point right here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an open Wi-Fi network, as you see right there. And then we're going to connect to it using our host operating system. Or I'm going to kind of rewind a little bit. Yeah, so we're going to connect to it using our host operating system. And then from our host operating system, we're going to send 5 ICMP packets to the AP, right? And you know what we should expect here is we should receive 5 ICMP responses from the AP. That's the expected behavior. As you can see, we do. So on the attacker machine, which is over here on the left, we're going to run a modified version of Wi-Fi tap called Wi-Fi ping, which all that it does is just, you know, anytime it sees an ICMP packet on the network, it injects a response to that packet. And you know, this is a really cool, really easy way of demonstrating that's possible to bypass client isolation. And by the way, this attacker is not even associated with the same network as this is happening. So we're going to run this tool. And you see here we're sending 5 more ICMP packets, but this time we're receiving 10 responses. So I mean, that's just blowing client isolation right out of the water, because you know, we're not even associated with the same network, and we're sending valid responses that the victim here is actually receiving and acknowledging as legitimate. So food for thought, though. We've kind of, you know, a lot of this talk has been about whether or not, you know, breach containment actually works at identifying an authorized or unauthorized device on a network. But what if we're missing the point? You know, when we think about NAC, the role of NAC in containing a wireless breach, we're using it to prevent attackers from accessing sensitive resources after the breach occurs. And the way that we're doing this is that when an unauthorized endpoint is detected, we're going to take one of 2 actions. We're going to either place the endpoint in quarantine, or we're going to block off the port entirely. And you know, essentially what this boils down to is that, you know, if we violate an access control policy, this is going to cause the NAC device to impose some kind of restriction. On a wired network, this is a physical restriction, right? I mean, it actually physically blocks the port off, and you can't send traffic that way. On a wireless network, as we saw with Wi-Fi tap, these kinds of restrictions can only possibly be logical restrictions. So more on this in a bit. I want you to imagine this is actually a pretty typical scenario that you'll find, like in penetration testing, red teaming, whatever, is that, you know, you breach a WPA2 enterprise network by taking advantages of the rogue AP attack that we saw at the very beginning. But you'll very quickly find yourself, you know, unable to really access much, because, you know, even if this network's used to access sensitive internal resources deeper on the network, which is where eventually you want to end up, you're going to have these NAC devices there in place that kind of immediately flag you as, well, it usually takes about a minute or so actually, but that flag you as an unauthorized endpoint, and you end up on this quarantine VLAN. So, you know, I guess what we're going to try to answer here is how can we move from this quarantine VLAN and bypass these restrictions and get over to the restricted VLAN, and hopefully from there be able to access sensitive resources, start to escalate privileges on the network, et cetera. In other words, how do we get out? So before we continue, there is like one more thing we have to review before we kind of talk about this, and that is something called redirect to SMB. Anyone familiar with a redirect to SMB attack? Okay, so the way a redirect to SMB attack works is that you essentially trick a victim into visiting an HTTP endpoint. So you provide them with a URL, they click on it, and this URL will take them to a specially configured web server that you are running. And this web server is designed to do one thing and one thing only, and that's redirect all HTTP traffic to an SMB share on the attacker's machine. So in other words, victim clicks the link, they're taken to this HTTP server. The HTTP server gives them a 302 redirect to an SMB server that you're running that requires authentication. And then this forces the victim's browser to authenticate with your SMB server. And so essentially what you can do this is you can use this to force victims into performing NTLM authentication with you and capture NTLM hashes that way, or relay them to things. There's a variation of this, which kind of builds off of LMNR and MBTNS poisoning, where you redirect them to a non-existent SMB share, and that triggers LMNR and MBTNS. Ask me about that later if you're curious, but it's not the main way of doing this. But it's a really fast way to get hashes. Unfortunately, it also requires social engineering. But with that in mind, that's about 5% of our escape attempt. We're going to have to build off of this a little bit to make this work. All right, cool. Here's the first new attack that we're going to introduce with all that background info out of the way. And this is going to be the hostile portal attack. And you can use it to steal AD credentials from wireless networks without being directly associated with the wireless network. Have you guys seen something like this before? It's captive portal all the time. So you see them a lot in like hotels and coffee shops. And essentially, the captive portal is a mechanism that's used to kind of like restrict access to open wireless networks. But the way that they work essentially is you connect to the network, and all of your DNS queries, I mean, the DNS server in use is going to recognize that you haven't authenticated with this little thing yet, so it's going to resolve all your DNS queries to the location of this page, this login page. So you try to access something else, by domain name, but you're still going to end up back here because your domain that you're entering is going to be resolving to the location of this login page. If you could potentially get around that by using by specifying a DNS server manually and not using the one that they provide to you. But you can also, because the AP is going to be acting as your network gateway, they can simply redirect your DNS traffic to their DNS server. So even if you try to use a different DNS server to get around this, the fact that the gateway can still redirect DNS traffic means that you're still gonna end up back at this page. And finally, if you really want to be sneaky, I guess you could try specifying HTTP addresses by IP address instead of using DNS. But wait, they still are the gateway, so they still can redirect HTTP traffic, and by doing that, send you back to this login page, which gets rid of DNS caching issues as well, by the way. So the point here is that what a captive portal is, essentially all HTTP traffic is being redirected to this portal page, to this login page that we see. So a hostile portal attack, it kind of is similar to this, except we're kind of mixing this with a redirect SMB attack. We're forcing, the way that it works is that you first force a victim device to connect to you using a rogue access point attack. And then instead of redirecting all their traffic to like a login page or something, you redirect it to a rogue SMB server. And what does that cause them to do? Similar with the redirect SMB attack that we saw earlier, that'll actually cause the victim's browser to authenticate with the attacker. So the whole workflow for this attack is that you force them to connect to you, you start redirecting their HTTP traffic to SMB, and that forces them to perform NTLM authentication with you. So just kind of another demo here. So we have in this scenario here, we have a attacker that's here on the left, and we have a legitimate Wi-Fi access point that's running in this terminal over here on the top right. On the bottom right, we have our victim, which is called Jenkins. We do have a Leroy that we're going to introduce later. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to force this victim to roam from the legitimate access point, which is in the top right, to the attacker's access point, which is on the left. We're going to do that just by sending some DOF packets over to the legitimate access point. So this causes the victim to connect with the attacker. At this point, the victim just opens up Internet Explorer, which takes them to a login, their home page, which is HTTP traffic, which, as you can see, was instantly redirected to SMB, and we captured hashes in that way. The whole thing took about 20 seconds or so, and that's just with me clicking around. So it's a pretty fast attack. I mean, that was a demo using an open network. Obviously we're talking about EAP networks, so we're going to have to build off of this and make it work with EAP. When we talk about EAP, as we mentioned, most cases this is going to be EAP TTLS and EAP PEEP. And both of these use MS-Chaffee2 as the inner authentication method. Interesting thing about MS-Chaffee2 is that it's a mutual authentication protocol. Essentially, we mentioned that the client device has to prove knowledge of its own password by sending a challenge response to the server. But then after that happens, the server actually has to prove knowledge of the victim's password, or should I say victim's password, to the client's password back to the victim. So the very last stage of this protocol, essentially, you have to send a valid challenge response, or authentication response, should I say, back to the victim that proves that is derived from the victim's password. So what this means is that although as an attacker you can force the victim to authenticate with you using an evil twin and use this to steal hashes, your radius server is still going to fail the final stage of the authentication process, and this will cause the client, the client will not be able to associate with you after that. And considering that you need that full association to do the hostile portal attack or anything else for that matter, that isn't just stealing radius credentials, we need a way around this. So there are a couple of solutions to this problem. The first one is to use an attack, or a technique, should I say, introduced by Don White and India Villiers in 2014 called auto-crack and add. And the second, that works against weak radius credentials. If you have stronger radius credentials, remember we have a very, very quick turnaround time for cracking MS-CHAP-v2. So the second solution is if you can't use the auto-crack and add because the password's too strong, at this point you kind of shift approaches and just crack it offline and finish the attack later, which you should be able to do that in about a day or so. So what we're looking at here is the very end of the MS-CHAP-v2 authentication process from the perspective of the attacker. Here it says host APD. That's because that's the radius server that you typically use for performing this kind of attack. So the way host APD works is that once you receive that challenge response from the victim, it's then going to validate it, and then if it's a valid challenge response, it's going to load the victim's password or password equivalent NT password hash from this. It's kind of actually, so it's called the EAP user file. It's kind of a very primitive database implemented using a text file. I know it's bad, but that's just how it's implemented. But it's going to attempt to load this password from the EAP user file and use that to construct the authentication response. This is actually where this process will start to break down if we don't have prior knowledge of the victim's password, which if we're attacking the victim in the first place, we probably don't have. So with auto-crack and add, what you do is you modify this whole process so that once you receive that challenge response, instead of immediately loading or attempting to load the user's credentials from the EAP user file to construct the authentication response, you instead send the challenge response that you received to a remote cracking rig. Obviously you're not going to have the sufficient computing power on your laptop to do this, but you essentially make an API call to a remote cracking rig. And this cracking rig is then going to attempt to very, very quickly crack this password hash. And if it's a weak radius credential, this can happen anywhere between like seconds or minutes. So the idea is that hopefully you should be able to get a response in time that you can just append it to the end of the EAP user file. And once you do that, then you just proceed with the authentication process by loading your freshly cracked password from the EAP user file, constructing an authentication response, and then sending that to the victim. Of course, if it's a relatively strong password, that's going to fail because it's going to time out. So that's where you have to, if it's like kind of a medium to strong password, you need to kind of shift gears and go into the, just crack offline, finish the attack later. But I mean, that's still 24 hours max if you're using FPGA-based hardware, so it's not really a huge deal. So this is a modified version of the hostile portal attack we saw earlier. Same setup, we have the attacker on the left, authentic access point on the top right, and then we have the victim device, Jenkins, on the bottom right. Although this time, this is going to be operating as a EAP network, and we're going to be using auto-crack and add to kind of get around this issue of needing prior knowledge of the victim's password. So you see here, we're going to kind of force it to connect to us. This is actually what you see. I'm going to pause this really fast. This is actually the certificate warning that you'll receive on Windows 8 if you are being forced to connect to a rogue access point. As you can see, it's not very specific. It just says, do you expect to find this network here? And considering you were just connected to this network a few minutes ago, I mean, that's not very informative. But some other operating systems, they have more informative prompts. But as you can see, it's not much for the user to go by. Anyways, the user connects, and we have hashes already, just because we were able to redirect that HTTP traffic at that point. So what this attack gets you lots and lots of NTLM hashes very quickly. You get similar results to what you'd get with LMNR and MBTNS poisoning. You have a few key advantages here, though. You don't need direct network access, and you're also not limited to a local subnet in the way that you would be if you were attacking LMNR and MBTNS. And the reason for that is you get everything that's connected to wireless. It's also not a passive attack. You're not waiting for like broadcast requests to start appearing on a subnet like you would with LMNR and MBTNS poisoning. Instead, you're forcing this to happen. So that's our first new attack. Back to our scenario we were talking about earlier, though. This is where we're going to introduce the second new attack that we're going to talk about today, and that's the indirect wireless pivot. And this kind of builds off the first thing we talked about. And this is a way of using rogue AP attacks to bypass port-based access control mechanisms. So we mentioned here that we're stuck on this quarantine VLAN. We've breached this network, the perimeter of this network, but as soon as we try to associate with it, our wireless device has been given an IP address on this quarantine VLAN because we've been identified by this NAC as unauthorized to be there. We want to pivot over to this restricted VLAN and continue escalating privileges on the network, accessing sensitive resources, and generally doing all the things that a hacker would want to do once they access a network. It's worth pointing out, though, in order to get access to this network in the first place, we would have had to attack a wireless client device. And so that means that we have at least one authorized device on this network that we can kind of leverage and attempt to pivot through. And it's sitting here on the restricted VLAN. So the first step of the indirect wireless pivot is you're going to force this authorized wireless device to associate with you. Actually, let me rewind a little bit. Let's assume, by the way, that we have two wireless interfaces, with two wireless cards. Your first one is being used to connect to this network. It has an IP address on this wireless network. Your second wireless device, your second wireless card, is currently unused, and you're free to use that to perform attacks. So we're going to use that second wireless card to force this victim device to connect to us using a rogue AP attack. We're then going to implement a hostile portal attack and use that to steal NTLM hashes. We can then crack those NTLM hashes. Pick up where we left off. At this point, we may have to perform the initial rogue AP attack again to get this to connect to us. But we pick up where we left off and use this new level of access to place a timed payload on the victim. This payload can be like a scheduled task or something. And what this payload is going to do when it executes, it's going to send a reverse shell back to the IP address, not of the second wireless interface, but the first wireless interface that's currently in quarantine. We're then going to kill our second, we're then going to kill our rogue AP that is currently running on our second wireless interface. That's going to allow the victim to reassociate with the target wireless network. Now remember, this victim is an authorized device, so where's it going to go? It's going to go back over to this restricted VLAN. And from there, a couple minutes later, we'll get the reverse shell from back to our first wireless interface. And this could be the best NAC in the world, and it wouldn't matter. We would have just gone around it completely. So a better approach to this, that was cool, but there was some password cracking involved, which is less than ideal. But if let's say we have two wireless devices now, and we need two because if you look up SMB reflection, you'll see that you used to be able to do this with one, but that's no longer possible because of a patch that came out like about 10 years ago. But let's say that we have two wireless devices, authorized wireless devices on the network. At this point, and we have like a account that can access both. We could use our second wireless interface once again, but to perform a rogue AP attack that forces these devices to connect to us. But this time, instead of merely using the hostile portal attack to capture hashes, we instead use it to perform an NTLM relay attack from one device to the other. And what that lets us do, that lets us instantaneously place a timed payload on one of the victim devices. Kill the rogue AP, that allows the devices to reassociate with the target network. They're moved to the restricted VLAN, and we just wait for the reverse shell, like before. So here's a quick demo of just implementing. We're going to implement this using, this is the kind of attack that really you can implement it however you want. I'm using EAP, which is a tool I wrote for doing the hostile portal attacks, along with a bunch of other stuff, as well as, anyone here used Empire before? Okay, anyone here used Metasploit before? Couple of hands. So it's a post-exploitation framework, has a really good agent for doing that. It's mainly written in PowerShell, but it's really, really good for attacking Active Directory. And we're also going to use SMB Relay X as our NTLM relay server, and that's going to be that's actually part of the IM package, although you can pretty much use anything you want for it. So the first thing we're going to do, this is just kind of getting things set up, is we're launching, actually before I continue, we have our two victim devices are at the top here. We have Jenkins, which we were working with before. We also have Leroy on the top right. So we have Leroy and Jenkins are our victims. We have, on the left here, we have our legitimate access point. And on the right, we have all the terminals that correspond to the attacker using virtual machines. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to spam some deauth packets at these two victims, directed deauthentication attacks. That's going to force them to roam over to our BSSID, our rogue BSSID here. And now we have one connected to us, we want the other one to connect to us as well. So we're going to force this thing over to roam over to us. And any second there. I hope this like text isn't too terribly small. Because I really, oh, that looks, it's a little blurry, isn't it? Oh well, I'll put this stuff online. So, okay, so now that we've done that, we're going to need the IP addresses of one of our victims to launch our SMB relay attack. So we're just going to copy that and paste it over to our SMB relay server, which we see here. So we paste it over the SMB relay server. We've started the SMB relay server, and now we're going to generate some HTTP traffic on one of our victims. So we see here that we're going to do that. We've just typed some stuff in the address bar. The autocomplete feature generates HTTP traffic, so we could use that to execute the SMB relay attack, which you could see all this massive wall of text that's the SMB relay attack executing. We should receive a reverse connection very soon from our Empire terminal. Yep, see that green text right there? That is our initial connection from our Empire agent, which is just executed successfully on this victim device. And we want to see who we're currently connected to and verify that. So we're just going to do a couple shell commands. Who am I, which will just tell us who we are, what our privileges are. We have NT authority system privileges, which is really high, so that's good. And we're going to execute the host name command as well, which that will tell us which of these two devices we're currently connected to. And there's a 45-second delay on commands here, so I'm trying to skip forward through that. All right, so it says Jenkins. So we currently have a reverse shell with system privileges in Jenkins at the moment. So at this stage, right, both of these devices have been forced to connect to us, and we performed an SMB relay attack, which gives us system access inside of this device here. You know, they're no longer connected to the target network, they're connected to us, and we have a shell on Jenkins. So we're going to use that shell to create a scheduled task that will send a reverse shell back to our first wireless interface, which is currently in quarantine. So we're going to do that. And there's actually a module for creating scheduled tasks in Empire, which is kind of why I'm using it for this. I'm going to kind of fast forward through all the little configs there to save time. All right, so we've done that. We've now, at this point, what we're doing is we're taking down our rogue AP. As you can see here by this text that's happening in this terminal, the victims are now reassociating with the target network, which is great. That's exactly where we want them. And at this point, we've set the scheduled task to execute 10 minutes in the future. So something really interesting happened when I recorded this bit, was that I actually made a little bit of a mistake in the sense that, so these are all, I'm working with virtual machines here. I actually forgot to attach the virtual USB adapter to the VM instance here that we're seeing. So what happened is that although the victim here, Jenkins, that the payload did execute, it wasn't able to send an initial reverse connection back to or send that reverse shell back to the network interface, because the network interface wasn't plugged in. So I was like, oh, well, shoot, I'm going to have to kind of like re-record this whole thing. But then something really interesting happened that was pretty cool, so I left it in there. And what happened was that I had configured this, actually for something I was working on earlier, I'd configured Empire to, when it ever creates like a payload like that, essentially the payload is going to try 120 times to connect back to the attacker at 45-second intervals. So essentially, what ended up occurring is, as you can see here, I plugged I reattached the adapter, the correct one. And then I start clearing out all these terminals to kind of like re-record the demo videos. And I go back to Empire and, oh, hey, what's that? It's the green text. Okay, I got the reverse connection anyways, once I plugged the thing in. And so essentially, you know, it kept trying to reconnect. I plugged in the virtual network interface, and then it worked. And I thought that was pretty cool, so I left it in there, because it kind of, you know, as kind of a latent function of that, it kind of like proves an interesting point about well-written implants and well-written malware, is the fact that, like, you know, you don't necessarily have to immediately be able to receive reverse connection. As long as you have something that's able to persistently try to get back to the attacker, it'll still work. So I just, for kind of like, I thought that was cool, so I kind of left it in there. But yeah, so at this point we received the connection back from the payload that was executed by the scheduled task, and now but this time we have essentially a reverse connection back to our quarantined interface, which has let us bypass the restricted VLAN. So the reason why this works, the equivalent technique in a wired network would be like literally walking up to a computer that's plugged into the wall, unplugging it from the wall and plugging it into your own router instead, and then attacking it. Oh.
Wrap it up quickly.
2 minutes? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the equivalent technique would be literally unplugging a device from the wall and connecting to a hostile network on which you can attack it. The reason why this attack works is that when you think about port-based access controls, they rely on the assumption that the physical layer is something you can trust. In a wireless network, though, the only means that you have of trusting the physical layer is your WPA2. So if you're using a weak form of EAP to provide access to that WPA2, that trust in the physical layer is basically shattered, which allows attackers to control the physical layer using rogue IP attacks, which renders port-based NAC mechanisms useless. What this demonstrates is that using NAC mechanisms to mitigate the risk presented by weak WPA2 implementations, it doesn't actually work. And it also demonstrates that adding port-based NAC mechanisms to wireless networks for the purpose of compensating for EAP TTLS and EAP-PEEP, it's actually not really appropriate, especially if the network in question is being used to grant access to sensitive resources. Before I wrap this up, I'm going to make a quick last-ditch case for EAP TLS. It's really not as bad to deploy as it used to be. You can leverage group policy very heavily when configuring 802.1x clients. Your best option is still to use a private CA and to leverage AD as much as possible to deploy EAP TLS. You can even use Let's Encrypt, although the folks at Let's Encrypt will even tell you themselves this is probably not the best way to do this. So just some closing thoughts. Just because wireless and wired networks operate similarly at the logical level, it doesn't mean that they work the same way at the physical level. And as a community, we should really question whether it's a sound business decision to neglect EAP TLS in favor of more reactive approaches that focus on access control and threat containment. And finally, if there's one thing to take away from this, it's that the needs for convenience and security are often at odds with one another. So it's important to maintain a healthy skepticism to propose solutions that promise both. Thanks. Do we have time for questions, or?
I'm afraid we don't have time to, but I guess he'll be available during the pause for a few questions, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah, I'll
thank you very much for your talk and many demos as well.
Thanks.
That was great.